Today, in our time together, I want to talk about the fourth reason James gives us for why we should learn to control our tongue. So far, he's told us that we should control our tongue because of the following reasons. Number one is because its potential to condemn us is so great. Secondly, James tells us to control our tongue because it has such enormous power to control us. And then third, he tells us to control our tongue because of its propensity to corrupt us, to corrupt our lives. Well, the fourth reason James tells us to control our tongue, and where I want to pick up in our study today, is because of its primordial nature to combat against us. Because of its primordial nature to combat against us. Now, what I mean by primordial nature is that the tongue is wild, it's untamed, it's, savage. Our tongue is uncivilized and undisciplined. We would say the tongue is irrepressible, it's irresponsible. And the tongue, given every opportunity, will combat every effort or attempt to try and control it. Now, have you noticed that about the tongue? Maybe your tongue or someone else's tongue? It wants to control, not to be controlled. So I want you to notice what James says in chapter 3 of his little book in verses 7 and 8. He says, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Now, what he's saying to us is that the tongue is untamable. And in that sense, it's primitive. It's uncivilized, undisciplined, humanly untamable. And that's why it's so dangerous. And unregenerate tongues are all the more dangerous. You see, the tongue, apart from the regenerating power of God in a person's life, cannot be tamed. And James says God gave man the power to control animals. For example, you'll remember in Genesis, even after the fall, God reiterated to Noah that he'd be able to get all the animals into the ark. And when God said to Noah, you're going to bring them in 2 by 2, God gave Noah the ability to control those animals to make sure that they were brought in or they got into the ark 2 by 2. And today, even today, man still dominates the animal kingdom. Man is still able to tame animals. Now, if you've ever been to the circus, you've seen lions that are tamed. You've seen a guy, stick his head in the mouth of a lion. You've seen people ride killer whales. I mean, for the most part, man is able to tame wild animals. And by that, I'm referring to, ferocious, large, strong beasts, the fiercest of them all and the deadliest of them all. Even when it comes to snakes crawling all over them, people are still able to control them. And so he says to us in verse 7, every kind, every species, and then he names two that walk and fly. He names those that walk and fly and those that swim and crawl. And we know that those that walk and fly are beasts and birds, and those that crawl and swim are snakes and things in the sea. Now, of course, the most notable animals are those that walk and fly, aren't they? And the least notable would be those that swim and crawl. And the word that James uses for beast, by the way, is never used for domesticated animals. The words that he uses here. But he says that man can even tame the wild animals. And he can tame the birds, and he can tame the reptiles, and he can tame even the creatures of the sea. And we all know that. We all know it. We see it. They're being tamed. It's present tense. Continuously being tamed is the idea. And they have been all throughout history. Man has subdued or tamed all of these various creatures. But James says that no one can tame the tongue. No one among men can tame the tongue. No one's able to do it. No one has the power to do that. Even in us as believers, as Christians, the tongue breaks out of its cage occasionally, doesn't it? We can't always control our tongue. Now, James doesn't say, and I want you to note this, he doesn't say that the tongue can't ever be tamed. He specifically says that man can't tame it. There's a difference. I hope you got that. He doesn't say the tongue can't ever be tamed, but he simply says to us the truth is that man can't tame it. Well, then the question is, who can tame it? Well, the answer is simple. God can, by his power. God can tame our tongue through his power working in our life. Do you remember that the first recorded sin after the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve sinned against God, came from an untamed tongue? And it happened when Adam blamed God for what happened. So the first sin was the sin of the tongue. And James says to us, the seriousness of man's inability to control his wild, savage tongue is because our tongue is a restless evil. It's a restless evil. It's always ready to break out. The tongue always wants to break out. It fights against restraint. It doesn't want to be held back. Restless is the same word that's translated unstable back in chapter 1, verse 8 of this book of James. And then James tells us that the tongue is not only a restless evil, but it's an evil poison or a deadly poison. It's not only like a caged animal, a monster of inconsistency wanting to break out of its restraint, but when it does break out, it carries with it a death-dealing venom, just like a snake's tongue. You know, Romans chapter 3, verse 13 says this. Speaking of unbelievers, their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Psalm 140, verse 3. They make their tongues as sharp as a serpent's. The poison of vipers is on their lips. You see, the tongue is like a deadly snake. It spews out deadly poison. It's an assassin that's looking to kill and to destroy. And unfortunately, sometimes that ungodly tongue can even be evidenced in Christians and believers as we say and speak things that we shouldn't. In Psalm 64, verses 1 through 8, the psalmist writes these words. He says, "Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint. Protect my life from the threat of the enemy. Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the plots of evildoers. They sharpen their tongues," listen to this, "like swords, and aim cruel words like deadly arrows. They shoot from ambush at the innocent. They shoot suddenly without fear. They encourage each other in their evil plans. They talk about hiding their snares. They say, 'Who will see it?' They plot injustice and say, 'We have devised a perfect plan. Surely the human mind and heart are cunning.' But God will shoot them with his arrows. They will suddenly be struck down. He will turn their own tongues against them and bring them to ruin. All who see them will shake their heads in scorn." The psalmist says here that God's going to turn their tongues against them because their tongues are like arrows, spears, and swords. You see, the tongue is, as I said a moment ago, an assassin. Do you remember in the Old Testament that the snake-mouthed princes of Ammon spoke lies against David? They accused him of hypocrisy in honoring Nahash, their king, and his son Hanun. And the result was that the king put together an army of his own thousands and added mercenaries, numbering 30,000 foot soldiers plus, and sent them to destroy David because of that lie, for no reason at all. And the result was an absolutely terrible slaughter of 700 Syrian charioteers and 40,000 horsemen and their commander, all because of the lie of one man. Do you remember the poisonous tongue of Haman, who was to be Satan's tool for the extermination of all the Jews by the Medo-Persians in the book of Esther in the Old Testament? And remember, God saved the Jewish people through Mordecai and Queen Esther? And Haman, the man who plotted all of this with his evil tongue, was himself hanged on the very gallows that he had made for hanging the Jewish people. You know, we have this whole Middle East conflict going on right now. We've got Hamas trying to eradicate, and not only them, but much of the Middle East and many of those folks there who hate the Jews, trying to eradicate them from the face of the earth. And I am here to tell you that they will never be successful. For God will bless his people, and he has promised to keep the nation of Israel. And he will protect his people, because as the prophetical timetable of God unfolds, Israel is the centerpiece of what is going to happen. So God will foil and destroy the enemies of Israel, just as he did back in the time of Mordecai and Esther, when they were used of God to foil the plot of Haman. God will foil the plot of Hamas and any other terrorist group or organization or nation that wants to destroy his people Israel. And then, do you also remember the savage-tongued men who lied to King Zedekiah about the prophet Jeremiah? And they literally took Jeremiah and they threw him into a pit where he literally sank into the muck in Jeremiah 38. All because of falsehood. accusing him of things that were not true? How about the restless, wagging, poisonous lips of the Jewish leaders in the New Testament, who accused the greatest prophet ever, John the Baptist, of having a demon, and then accused Jesus himself of being a glutton, a drunkard, a friend of sinners, and that he himself was also demon-possessed? And the result of that was that both John the Baptist and Jesus were murdered. You see, many people have died because of the deadly poison, the venomous poison of the tongue. And even our own Lord was murdered because of lying tongues. In the New Testament, haters of the gospel secretly manipulated men to lie about Stephen. Remember Stephen? And they said that he spoke blasphemy against Moses and against God. And it was all a lie. And he'd never done that. But you'll remember that they stirred up the people with their words and their lies. And they stoned Stephen to death, according to Acts chapter 6. And then later, when the Apostle Paul arrived in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 21, we're told that the Jews from Asia stirred up the people against him, and they falsely accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple, a non-Jew. And so they dragged Paul out to kill him. But he was rescued by the Romans as they were trying to beat him to death. And he spent the next 2+ years in a Roman prison. And it goes on and on and on. The power and the peril of the tongue is a deadly, deadly poison, a deadly weapon, and has a killing reputation, killing joy, killing peace, killing love, killing everything in its wake. So my friends, the tongue must be controlled because of its potential to condemn, its power to control us, its propensity to corrupt us, and its primordial nature, as we have discussed today, to combat against us. You see, the tongue fights against everything in our lives. It is uncontrolled unless we learn to bring it under the control of God's Holy Spirit in our lives, living within us as Christians, God himself indwelling us. Because left to itself, the tongue is literally hell-bent on destroying everything in its way, because it's like an untamed animal devouring everything in its path, leaving a sea of destruction and a wasteland of devastation when left to itself. We have within our mouth the power to kill and to destroy others. Our mouth can either devastate those around us, or it can be a tool God can use to help and to build other people up. But the choice is ours. Will we control our tongue, or let it control us?